Welcome to the second video in a five-part series developed by the Louisiana Highway Safety Commission, or LHSC, to assist its subgrantees with better understanding the processes, procedures, and products associated with the subgrant program and contracting lifecycle. With over 110 subgrantees annually, it's hard to bring everyone together in one place and at one time to receive orientation on grant requirements, the subgrant manual, claims processing, performance monitoring, and other important topics. To make it easier for everyone, LHSC has created a series of short videos, each approximately 30 minutes in length, to provide much of the information needed as you kick off your subgrant. If you, as the project director, feel that one or more of these videos would be helpful for another person in your agency to view, please feel free to share it with that individual. Let's get started. As I said, this is part 2 in the video series to orient subgrantees to LHSC's subgrant program. While you're not required to view all 5 videos, they do provide helpful information to make the experience as easy as possible. The first video provides an overview of LHSC and some important but high-level expectations associated with the contract development process. This second video provides an overview of the manual for subgrants for the 2025 federal fiscal year. The third video reviews the budget categories and outlines the process and requirements to submit claims successfully. The fourth video describes some document retention requirements as well as the performance monitoring expectations for the grant period. The fifth and final video addresses parameters around communications, promotions, public education, and outreach while executing your LHSC-funded project. Most of this year's subgrantees have received funding from LHSC in the past and thus are familiar with the work of this agency. However, it bears reminder that the Louisiana Highway Safety Commission is the official state highway safety office for Louisiana and is tasked with administering the state's highway safety grant program. LHSC is committed to utilizing its funding to reduce traffic crashes and the resulting deaths, injuries, and property damage associated with them. Organizationally, LHSC is housed in the Louisiana Department of Public Safety, but over 90% of its funding is provided by the federal government through the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA. Thus, LHSC's work and the work of its subgrantees are subject to adherence to federal guidelines as well as state laws and regulations. Before we get very deep into this video, I want to provide some terms and definitions that you'll hear us use frequently. The first term is NHTSA. Again, this is the acronym for the federal agency that provides funding to LHSC and is also known as the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. The next term is subgrantee. This term refers to any and all entities that receive funds from LHSC to conduct traffic safety work. It includes individuals, contracting agencies, implementing agencies, subcontractors, and third-party contractors. While LHSC uses the term subgrantee, you may see similar terms such as subrecipient or contractor in some places in forms and other templates used by LHSC. These terms are all considered interchangeable. The next term is project director. Again, this is the individual at the implementing agency who will serve as the day-to-day contact for LHSC. The project director may identify additional people at your agency with whom LHSC should communicate, but the project director will always be the primary liaison to our agency. Program coordinator is the next term. This is the primary point of contact at LHSC that the project director interacts with. This person processes claims and provides guidance on all contract-related issues. The next term is subgrant agreement. This is the name of the main portion of the complete contract between LHSC and the contracting agency. It includes the project title, term period of the contract, funding source breakdown, performance measures and targets for the project, as well as the project deliverables. The final term we'll discuss is DocuSign. This is the web-based software LHSC uses to send its subgrantees agreements electronically for e-signature. If you haven't already done so, please pause this video and download the Federal Fiscal Year 2025 Manual for Subgrants, which was provided during the subgrant agreement contract signing process. If you did not access the manual at that time, it's no problem. You can find it by visiting the LHSC website. Go to www.lahighwaysafety.org and choose Grants among the headings listed along the top of the page. From there, select Subgrantee Resources, and then you'll see the first section is labeled Manual for Subgrants. The document posted there is the most current version of the subgrant manual. Once you've accessed the file, press play to resume this video. This webinar is meant to serve as a companion to, but not a replacement for, the FFY 2025 Manual for Subgrants. Now let's pause for a moment because you probably heard me use some language that's made you curious. Specifically, I'm referring to the terms Federal Fiscal Year and the acronym FFY. Let me explain what I mean by this before we proceed with this video. Government agencies do not operate their grants on a calendar year cycle, say from January to December. Rather, they operate on what are called fiscal year cycles. Even more confusing is the fact that state governments operate on different fiscal cycles than the federal government. Because the bulk of our funding, specifically the bulk being passed on to subgrantees like you, originates from federal dollars, our subgrant program follows a federal fiscal year cycle. Federal fiscal years, or FFYs for short, begin on the first day of October in one year and continue until the 30th day of September of the next year. The year in which the majority of the work is conducted is referenced when we shorthand the fiscal year. So though your subgrant begins on October 1, 2024 and extends until September 30, 2025, we refer to it as Federal Fiscal Year, or FFY 2025. I bet you're glad that I addressed this mystery, aren't you? Now let's move on. Okay, so you've gotten oriented to some of the beginning issues as it relates to the subgrant manual. The remainder of the webinar will focus on the content of the FFY 2025 subgrant manual. Over the next 40 minutes, I'll cover highlights from most sections of the manual. As a reminder, the information I provide should serve as guidance only and is general enough to be of relevance to enforcement and non-enforcement subcontracts. For specific instructions, please reference the manual or contact your program coordinator. We'll begin with Section 1, titled Subgrantee Responsibilities. When subgrantees accept highway safety funds, they agree to comply fully with all the requirements of the subgrant manual, as well as any periodic changes that occur during the grant year. They also agree to follow all state and federal guidelines for use of funds awarded in the subgrant agreement. Further, all subgrantees are required to identify a project director for the term of the grant year. Usually, this individual was identified on the project funding application, so LHSC has been communicating with that person. But subgrantees should notify their LHSC program coordinator immediately if the project director changes. The project director is responsible for establishing and maintaining procedures to ensure the effective administration of the grant funds, including the timely completion of the grant objectives and proper record keeping. This individual is ultimately responsible for the successful completion of the project. The project director may identify additional contacts at the subgrantee who should be included on communications between LHSC and the subgrantee to help ensure the proper administration of the subgrants. Section 2 of the subgrant manual is related to the access and availability of the subgrantee's information by LHSC. The contracting agencies are expected to establish and maintain separate accounts or funds for its highway safety grant. Accounting records and financial management documents, including budgets, ledgers, receipts, invoices, communications, and etc., should be retained and made available to LHSC or its federal funding agency upon request. Section 3 of the manual stipulates that copies of all documentation related to funded projects, including but not limited to accounting and financial management documents, must be retained for a period of 5 years from the date of the last payment received by the subgrantee. Contracting agencies should establish a document retention plan now to ensure compliance with this 5-year requirement. Subgrantees also must agree to the monitoring of both programmatic and fiscal matters during the subgrant period. Program coordinators are responsible for scheduling monitoring visits with their subgrantees. These visits may include virtual sessions, office visits, or program coordinators may decide to attend a funded event or activity. Monitoring should not be seen as a punitive act, but rather is a routine yet necessary part of subgrant management. Now we'll take sections 4 and 5 together because they go hand in hand. Section 4 refers to the timely performance of work. Subgrants are awarded for 1 fiscal year only at a time, so all work outlined in the scope of deliverables is expected to be completed in accordance with the project schedule and no later than the subgrant expiration date, without exception. LHSC cannot issue no-cost extensions, nor can funds awarded in one subgrant agreement simply be carried over to the next fiscal year's subgrant agreement. Finally, LHSC cannot prepay expenses to ensure payment is reimbursed prior to the end of the grant period. Sometimes subgrantees ask why there are so many restrictions on these federal funds when they've received grants from other federal agencies and those funds have more flexibility. The reason is twofold. First, LHSC's grant program is made possible only because the agency itself applies for and receives annual grants from NHTSA that are accessible for 1 year. Thus, because our funding has limited availability, we must also limit the duration of our subgrants to the same 1-year period. Secondly, LHSC's subgrants are reimbursable only, meaning that subgrantees must expend funds for the allowed expenses in the program budget before a subgrantee can submit a claim to request for LHSC to pay back those funds to the contracting agency. Reimbursable grant programs can be burdensome on contracting agencies, which must make funds available upfront, so shorter funding terms work better in these situations. While your program coordinator serves as a resource for technical questions related to allowable expenses, Section 5.2 of the Subgrant Manual provides a list of federal statutes and regulations that can be accessed to ensure expenses incurred in the process of executing your project are legal and allowable. Section 5.3 describes the procedures and parameters for subgrantees to repay any costs that might be incurred when expenses are deemed illegal. Section 5.5 and 5.4 of the Subgrant Manual are 2 important sections of the document. They answer the question, how do we get paid for work that we've done? As previously mentioned, this video focuses on providing highlights of the Subgrant Manual. So we will briefly address the submission of claim forms and guidelines for acceptable reimbursement documentation here, as it is covered in the Subgrant Manual. However, we will not go into explicit detail about the claims making process. Instead, that information is covered in the 3rd video of the orientation series titled LHSC Budget and Claims Processing. Project directors will receive reimbursement claim packets for each funded project. These packets are prepared by your program coordinator and should be used for the duration of the project period. The claim packet will have all of the LHSC forms you'll need to complete for each reimbursement claim submission. Every packet includes the following documents: a list of claim instructions to complete, a copy of the final project budget that was approved during the subgrant agreement signing process, a document titled Annex A, FFY 2025 Subgrant Claim Document, a list of acceptable supporting documents that should be considered for submission to justify the expenses outlined in Annex A, another document titled Annex B, Project Status Reporting Form, and another document titled Annex C, Summary of the Progression of Planning Program Activities. Some claim packets may have additional forms, such as a contractor's invoice template for those individual contracted subgrantees. Or packets may have an Annex A1 to document overtime hours worked by law enforcement officers who participate in our enforcement subgrants. To be eligible for reimbursement, a claim form with the project director's signature, all relevant documentation, and the relevant LHSC annex forms must be submitted. Claims are submitted electronically by email to lhscclaims@la.gov. You are welcome to copy your program coordinator's direct email address on these emails. Complete reimbursement claim packets should be submitted to this email address monthly, specifically by the 20th day of the next month, especially if work was conducted in the preceding month. However, claim packets should be submitted even when no work was conducted, because the packet also includes project status report information. Once submitted, the reimbursement claims packet is reviewed by your program coordinator. Your coordinator compares the amount claimed in each cost category with the overall budget and also assesses both fiscal and programmatic performance to this point. Depending upon your program coordinator's assessment result, your claim is either forwarded to the LHSC accounting team for processing or is returned with questions or requests for adjustments. Subgrantees are expected to respond promptly with corrections or revisions to keep reimbursement payments from being delayed. At the end of the grant, subgrantees are expected to submit their final reimbursement claim packet within 30 days as to ensure payment is received before LHSC accounts are closed out by state and federal funders. Unless otherwise stipulated in the subgrant agreement, final versions of any and all outstanding products are also due within 30 days after the last day of the grant period. Again, this section is not intended to provide in-depth instruction on the claims making process. Please view video 3 for more details. Also, you're welcome to recommend video 3 to any individuals at your agency who will be involved in completing and submitting your claim packets. At this point, we are on page 12 of the subgrant manual to address sections 6 through 8. Section 6 stipulates that subgrantees must follow State of Louisiana Office of State Procurement policies and procedures when making purchases or establishing subcontracts with a third party. Your program coordinator can serve as a resource for locating relevant state policies and procedures, but ultimately, subgrantees are responsible for reading and ensuring compliance with them. Section 7 references the Buy America Act. The law citation and the reference website address are provided in the subgrantee manual to find more information. Also, there is additional information about the Act in Section 33 or page 27 of the subgrant manual. The information in Section 33 clarifies that the purchase restrictions to Buy America are related to major purchases such as equipment, but also steel, iron, and manufactured products. Section 8 of the subgrant manual is about property control. Think back to your project budget. Of the 7 cost categories, did you receive approval for any funds to purchase equipment? If so, this section is very important to review. If not, it's good information to have, but it may not be relevant to your current project's completion. In summary, this section outlines the parameters for which property and equipment purchased with grant funds can be used only for the project work for which it was intended. In addition, the section addresses how to properly inventory, maintain, transfer ownership, and/or dispose of property or equipment that has been purchased with federal funds. Section 9 addresses subcontracts or third-party contracts. Again, think back to your project budget. Of the 7 cost categories, did you receive approval for funds under contractual services? If so, this means you, the LHSC subgrantee, intends to enter into a contract for services with an individual or agency that will assist with executing the work outlined in your project scope. While you may think of that individual or agency as a contractor, the relationship with LHSC is as a subcontractor as well, with equally legally binding subcontracts. This can also be referred to as a third-party contract, with LHSC counting as the first party, you, the subgrantee, counting as the second party, and the contractor counting as the third party. Regardless of what you call it, the point of this section is to ensure you understand that you must do the following as you negotiate with the entity that will be providing contractual services for which you were approved. First, you must notify LHSC through your program coordinator when you determine who that subcontractor will be. Secondly, the terms and conditions outlined in this subgrant manual must be included as part of the contract between you and your contractor. Once your entire contract document has been developed, including the subgrant manual, and any terms and conditions you stipulate, your program manager should receive, review, and approve a copy prior to it being signed by your contractor. Sections 10 and 11 are relevant to products developed as part of the project's execution. Reports, studies, or other materials developed using grant funds received from LHSC must be approved by our agency as a final step, particularly if the subgrantee plans to issue a public release of the product. In cases of public release, approval must come from the LHSC Executive Director as well as the LHSC Public Information Officer. Even with approval granted in coordination with LHSC staff, the subgrantee must understand that it does not have authority to speak on behalf of LHSC, but rather represents its own views, opinions, and conclusions only. Furthermore, all products created with federal grant funds must be regarded as being in the public domain. This means that you, the subgrantee, cannot copyright the product or place any restrictions prohibiting distribution or reproduction of the product. While you can expect reasonable attribution of yourself and your agency as the creators, you cannot sell copies of the final product or any related materials prepared under the terms of your subgrant agreement. Finally, all products must, in addition to any logos of the contracting agency, display the approved LHSC logo, as well as the following message, quote, "The material was developed through a project funded by the Louisiana Highway Safety Commission." Section 12 of the subgrant manual addresses changes to subgrant agreements. LHSC recognizes that changes happen. Unique opportunities come along. People change jobs. Costs of products and services rise and fall, any of which can impact the way in which you will spend grant funds. Despite the 1 fiscal year duration of subgrant agreements, LHSC does allow subgrantees to request modifications to accommodate these kinds of changes. Modification requests must be documented in writing, in addition to obtaining any kind of verbal approval from your program coordinator. Different modifications require different levels of approval, so subgrantees should contact their program coordinator as soon as possible and should allow for the approval process to be completed before executing any changes. LHSC has a strict policy of not approving subgrant agreement modifications in the final month or 12th month of the fiscal year. So subgrantees should ensure all changes are addressed by month 11. Let's look at the kinds of changes that can happen to a subgrant agreement. A major change in a subgrant agreement is defined as 1, a change in the scope of the work, 2, an increase or decrease in the overall amount of obligated funding from LHSC to the subgrantee, and/or 3, a change to the source of funding from which LHSC must draw funds to cover project expenses. Changes like this are considered major, and they require a written amendment to your original subgrant agreement, which means the amendment agreement must go through the full approval process and requires signatures by all parties and DocuSign to be considered binding. Requests for this level of change are still subject to compliance with LHSC, state, and federal policies, laws, and regulations. A minor change in a subgrant agreement is defined as an increase or decrease between cost categories or subcategories not to exceed 10%. But the shift in cost categories or subcategories does not increase or decrease the total of the overall project budget. A minor change is considered a revision to your subgrant agreement, not an amendment. While it still requires a written request in advance from the project director and a written response from the LHSC program coordinator, a new subgrant agreement will not be generated through DocuSign. Section 13 stipulates that a subgrantee cannot replace the existing personnel assigned to the subgrant without first notifying LHSC. If personnel at a subgrantee resigns, retires, becomes ill, or has other factors that would keep them from performing the duties of the project, LHSC expects the subgrantee to identify new, equally qualified personnel in a reasonable amount of time to avoid delays in completing tasks. Section 14 stipulates that the LHSC Executive Director has the authority to impose sanctions upon a subgrantee with non-compliance with the provisions of the subgrant. Sanctions can range from withholding payment of claims until subgrantees come into compliance, all the way to suspension, cancellation, or even termination of the subgrant. Section 15 is related to documenting good accounting practices at subgrantees. Specifically, Section 15.1 states that public sector subgrantees, i.e., those designated as state or local government or nonprofit organizations that receive $1 million or more in total federal funds, must have an audit made in accordance with the referenced federal rule. Audits must be conducted by an independent auditor, and a copy of the audit must be provided to LHSC. Again, this is for public sector subgrantees receiving $1 million or more only. Section 15.2 says that all subgrantees, meaning individuals, state government, local government, nonprofit organizations, and private institutions, must provide a signed audit certification letter prior to submitting their first claim. This is not the same as an audit. Instead, this is a single-page document where the project director verifies that their agency has either been audited, will be audited at some point in the fiscal year, or is not subject to audit because they do not meet the funding threshold. The document titled Single Audit Certification is included in the electronic subgrant agreement packet in DocuSign. Section 16 is brief, but important because it requires subgrantees to agree that they will not use grant funds to pay for routine and/or existing public services that are usually expected to be provided and paid for with existing local, state, and federal government dollars. The act of doing this is called supplanting, which means to supersede or replace. For example, LHSC provides funds to many law enforcement agencies to cover overtime pay for officers to conduct targeted traffic safety enforcement work. This section prohibits LHSC funds to be used to pay for officers to conduct their regular 9-to-5 work instead of using local or state funds in an effort to save money or purchase products or services with these cost savings. Sections 17 through 19 relate to and reinforce reporting documentation for legal entities. Section 17 states that any for-profit corporation whose stock is not publicly traded must disclose the owner or owners of the corporation through a formal affidavit and file the document with the Louisiana Secretary of State's office. This is a requirement for all for-profit corporations as they register to do business in the state of Louisiana anyway. Is your contracting agency a corporation, either a for-profit or nonprofit? Section 18 is only relevant to those types of entities. If your agency is a for-profit or nonprofit corporation, the board that governs the agency must pass a resolution identifying the individual responsible for conducting financial business between the agency and LHSC. Once the board resolution has been passed, a copy must be shared with LHSC. Section 19 is only relevant to contracting agencies that were incorporated in a state other than Louisiana. If so, a certificate of authority must be submitted to LHSC. This is the same certificate of authority that the corporation would have submitted to the Louisiana Secretary of State's office in order to get approval to conduct business in this state. This section would not be relevant to most of our subgrantees. Sections 20 through 25, listed on page 16, relate to various federal policies, laws, and regulations. Section 20 requires subgrantees to comply with the Fair Labor Standards Act. Section 21 ensures that minority business enterprises get maximum opportunity to participate in federally funded contracts and subcontracts. Section 22 requires subgrantees to comply with the Federal Privacy Act when certain work is performed. Section 23 certifies that no negative environmental impact will result from the execution of your project. Section 24 recognizes the Federal Energy Policy and Conservation Act. And Section 25 requires the subgrantee to certify that it was not required or coerced into obtaining this subgrant in exchange for employment, payment, or other such favors, gifts, or rewards. Sections 26 and 27 require subgrantees to adopt traffic safety-friendly policies. Section 26 requires subgrantees to adopt and enforce a policy requiring employees and others riding in subgrantee-owned or leased vehicles to always wear their seatbelts while riding in these said vehicles. Section 27 strongly encourages subgrantees to institute bans on text messaging while driving in accordance with existing state law. Section 28 of the Subgrant Manual requires subgrantees to comply with state child protection laws. If any agents, employees, or assignees engaging in work on behalf of the subgrantee are under the age of 18. Section 29 of the Subgrant Manual deals with several expectations from the federal government. Section 29.1 requires subgrantees to register in the Federal System for Award Management, or SAM, to maintain an active SAM registration for the duration of the project lifecycle. You may recall that you were required to enter your unique entity identifier number on your application, so your organization is already registered in this system. You just need to ensure your account remains active. Section 29.2 states that subgrantees are required to notify LHSC if they fall out of good standing with local, state, or federal government agencies. If you or your agency gets suspended or debarred by any government entity, you're required to notify LHSC immediately. If LHSC is notified through other means, it could result in suspension or termination of your subgrant and prohibition from receiving future subgrant funds. Section 29.3 stipulates that each subgrant, as well as any subcontractor or third-party contractor, must certify that it does not appear on the list of parties excluded from federal procurement or non-procurement programs. Section 29.4 requires subgrantees to provide a copy of their internal control policies to LHSC. This must be done before submitting your first claim. Internal control policies are those that document the grant management and financial reporting processes, procedures, and policies of the agency. This document can include organizational charts, flow charts, decision tables, and memos or policy statements. Essentially, it's a document that outlines the internal accounting and other controls to prove that your agency can manage a federal grant program in compliance with applicable laws and regulations. At a minimum, the policy should describe the levels of supervisor approval for grant-funded activities, regular and overtime hours worked, and other eligible expenses. Subgrantees may submit their internal controls policies electronically or by hard copy. Section 30 is a fancy way of saying that each term or condition outlined in the subgrant manual is separate and apart from the others, especially that they are legally independent parts. Thus, if one part of your subcontract agreement and/or this subgrant manual is deemed unenforceable or illegal, the remainder of the contract and manual do still apply. Section 31, beginning on page 17 and continuing on to page 18, is standard indemnification and limitation of liability language. It is important to have your risk management official review this section. Essentially, subgrantees commit to full liability of the actions of any and all individuals conducting work on LHSC-funded projects. Further, this section states that LHSC, referred to in this section as the state, shall be secure against legal liability. Section 32 identifies the manual for subgrants and the LHSC subgrant agreement combined as a full and complete contract for services between the parties of the state of Louisiana, and fill in the name of your contracting agency. This means that any prior negotiations, conditions, statements, or agreements that were made in writing or verbally prior to the development of these documents, but not included in this document, are null and void. Instead, this contract becomes effective upon final approval by the LHSC Executive Director. Section 33 is titled Certifications and Assurances. Beginning on page 19 and continuing to page 31 is essentially a document within a document. These specific pages originated from the federal grant application that LHSC submitted to NHTSA. On page 31, you will see the LHSC Executive Director signed off that, to the best of her knowledge, her agency and all of its subgrantees, that's you, would uphold the policies, regulations, and provisions outlined in Section 33. Some of the sections of these certifications or assurances are very similar to content that we've already covered and that is included in the subgrant manual. For example, certification regarding suspension and debarment, the Buy America Act, the policy on seatbelt use, and the policy on texting while driving. Other sections contain new information. Sections such as the non-discrimination section, political activity description, the certification regarding federal lobbying, and the section that describes the restrictions on state lobbying. It is important to read all of these sections as they are considered part of the subgrant manual, and thus, as stated in Section 32, are part of your full and complete contract for services. However, due to time restrictions, we have decided not to go through all of Section 33 in this video. This concludes the review of the Federal Fiscal Year 2025 Manual for Subgrants. Thank you for taking the time to view this video and better inform yourself of the legal commitments you and/or your agency are making as a participant in LHSC's Traffic Safety Grant Program. Remember, if you have any questions about your project, your primary point of contact at LHSC is your program coordinator. However, you're always welcome to contact LHSC's main line to request assistance if your program coordinator is not immediately available. As a reminder, this video is number 2 in a 5-part series. You're welcome to view any and all other videos in the series that you feel will be helpful to supporting your role as the project director. All videos and associated handouts can be accessed on the LHSC website. Simply go to www.lahighwaysafety.org and select Grants from the navigation bar on the top of the page. Once you select Grants, choose the option titled Subgrantee Resources from the drop-down list. The list of videos is the second set of items on the resource page. Thank you again for joining us for this video series.